started, again, welcome everybody to this webinar on Project Server 2013, Microsoft's latest release of Project and Project Server. This webinar is entitled What's New? This is part one of a multi-part series that we'll be releasing over the next few months. There's a lot of new enhancements and new features related to Project and Project Server. So rather than try to cover all of them in a 1 hour period, we're going to basically just organize it in a way that we're going to cover certain topics during each of the webinars. So to get started, my name is Leon Gallegos. I'm one of the senior project and project server trainers and consultants with MS Project Pros. We are in the North Dallas area out of Plano. Here's my contact information. If you guys have any follow-up questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to me. We won't spend a lot of time on all the background information. You guys can look that up and get any questions answered that you need to online. From an agenda perspective, this is essentially what we put together for this first part. As I mentioned, we have a few different webinars coming out here. Just to get things started, we want to talk a little bit about software requirements and different upgrade options, just a couple key things that you're going to want to be aware of. And then I want to talk a little bit about the architecture and some of the administration changes to this particular offering. We'll also look at some of the interface changes and a little bit on site management, because that's one of the big things that is new and different with this version. And then, of course, everybody's talking about this Project Online and the options that you have there when it comes to Project Online versus working with an on-premise solution. And then we'll do a demo covering some very specific topics like the enhancements, some of the changes to permissions, for example, some of the administrative areas, and then we'll just open it up to some questions. So hopefully within the hour we can get through all of these topics, and I think this is a better approach than trying to muscle our way through all of the different enhancements. We'll just release this in sections. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about software requirements and some of the upgrade options that you have. You're going to be coming from different environments, obviously a lot of you from 2010, some of you from 2007. So what are just some of the considerations you're going to have? The first thing is around just the base operating system. So here, 2012 is certainly acceptable. 2008 R2 with the First Service Act SP1. When you roll out the prerequisites and you're getting ready to do the installation, essentially the OS, the application web server tools are automatically enabled, and that's just part of the prerequisites. So it's not really something that you have to prepare to do. Just understand that that is going to be the role of the OS when you put Project Server and point on those machines. From a SQL perspective, 2012 and again 2008 are certainly acceptable. No support for 2005. Some of you are coming from earlier versions, Project 2007, for example, and running 2005. You're going to need to have that as one of your consideration points. From a SQL perspective, obviously the database engine, analysis services, management tools, connectivity components, these will be requirements in SQL when you're rolling out Project Server. From a feature usage perspective, and this is really based on how you're going to roll out the tool and what features you're going to use. For example, the My Tasks. If you expect to be using My Tasks, you're going to have end users coming in and logging in their time, and you want to have all that great functionality that My Tasks is providing you, the updating, for example, and the status and progress of the Exchange server is going to be a requirement for that, and it gives us the direct integration with Outlook, for example. Reporting through the OData also requires Excel 2013. So if you're going to be using any reports that take advantage of this new OData, essentially it's a protocol, it's an open data protocol that Microsoft has taken advantage of, you need Excel 2013. From a workflow perspective, if you expect to be developing your workflows when you're in 2013, then SharePoint Designer and Visio 2013 will also need to be in place for doing your workflow development. And I'll talk a little bit more about the workflow portion of it a bit later on. In terms of upgrades, a couple real critical things that are going on with 2013. The first thing is that we are moving from essentially the 4 databases that you were traditionally accustomed to with earlier versions of Project Server. So when you implement, those of you who were part of that, you know that these multiple databases that were created to support Project Server, well, that has basically been brought down to a single database. So that's one of the considerations you need to have as you look at upgrading. And that's better from the perspective of maintenance and management. Now we're just moving to the single database. The database attached is really the supported method for upgrading from earlier versions. If you are coming from 2007, then you will need to go to 10 and then go to 13. So that it's a 2-step process if you're coming in from 2007. And also there will be that database consolidation step when you're going from 2010 to 2013 as well. So these are just a couple things that, as you guys are planning, you want to be thinking about. From a client perspective, Project Professional 2013 is going to hook into Project Server 2013. So that was a little bit different in 2010, where if you were working in the backward compatibility mode in 2010, you could still have 2007 clients connecting to it, and that's not the case here. So everybody will need to be moved into Project Professional 2013. So a couple things you need to plan there. From a Project Web App perspective, all of the browsers that are supported in SharePoint 2013 will also be available to be used within the Project Web App, and that's IE obviously from 8 through 10, Firefox 10, Safari 5, and then the latest flavor of Google 17 for Google Chrome. So those browsers, which is a pretty big enhancement from a Project Web App perspective, that it's really more open and accessible to those non-Internet Explorer browsers that are going to be connecting to it. From a planning perspective, just a couple of key things here that I want you guys to be thinking about as you either are upgrading or even just planning to roll out 13 is a little bit on the performance and capacity planning. And this really incorporates your projects, your sites, your tasks, and your assignments. And Microsoft has done a really good job of putting out these different worksheets to help you with planning, planning these different areas out. And so there's really, kind of critical areas there, and that's around the performance, making sure that the system is going to, perform the way you need it to, and then user access. And this really comes into the SharePoint and project security portion of it. I'm going to talk about that in really at a high level here, and then more in a breakout session we'll get into the Project Server security. But you need to plan for that. Basically, how are users going to be interacting with PWA? And then, of course, just from a deployment perspective, number of users, what is the architecture going to look like? How is reporting, do you need SQL reporting services, analysis services, performance point, those types of things around reporting. And then from a lifecycle perspective, are you going to build out workflow in SharePoint Designer, for example, and Visio and Visio services? So just a couple things to consider around from an upgrade perspective. So architecture and administration changes. This is another critical point. I brought up the first part of it around the database consolidation. So when you are rolling out and not upgrading Project Server, when you enable the Project Server in your SharePoint, when you actually provision the PWA instance, you're only creating the single database. If you haven't heard a lot about the Azure platform, it's part of Microsoft's offering around what it does many things, but around the workflow, this is what's allowing you to build out your workflows in SharePoint Designer and then deploy them in the project web apps. That's where the workflows are primarily managed. In 2010, if you were going to customize your workflows, you either used a third-party application or used Visual Studio, and you deployed your workflows that way. So they're making it a lot easier to create and interact and manage workflows with 2013. And then the OData service, as I mentioned before, this is you can think of this as really an open protocol. It's an HTTP-based protocol, so those who are using projects online, for example, can develop these very powerful reports without really worrying about the connectivity to the actual data source. So it's in a more of a traditional way in which you're getting the data, but now we're using a protocol that's more web-centric. It's accustomed to working over the HTTP protocol. So that's a pretty big enhancement from a reporting perspective. They've also made some improvements around the queue management. So the queue has always been one of these areas that has come up from a troubleshooting and a maintenance and management perspective. So they definitely made an investment here around the way these jobs are being polled. So typically there was more of a timed polling of these jobs, and now really they've alleviated that, so the jobs are essentially just going to be processed through. And there's some key statistical points that they've been bringing up, that being Microsoft, around the performance enhancements there. From an administrative perspective, I mentioned this a little bit around the different permission models that you now have to choose from with 2013, and they're calling it permission modes, basically. Either SharePoint, which is the default permission mode that you'll get when you roll out Project Server, or the traditional Project Server mode, and I'll show you where that is as we go through the demo. They've also separated, from an administrative perspective, the different areas in Project Server. So the kind of the perspective that they took, which I think is a good one, is that those types of tasks that would traditionally be handled by more of an IT SharePoint type person around queue management, database backup and restorations, feature deployments and things like that, they're handling that in the SharePoint central admin area. And more PMO specific changes that would be made around custom fields and views and users are handled in the project web app, as opposed to throwing everything in one location. And I think that's definitely a good thing, so that way you can segment the responsibilities really into the two different areas. And we'll look at that in the demo. From an AD sync, there's definitely been some improvements here. So basically, when the system is synchronizing with these different AD groups, there's definitely a hit to the system. So the timing of the Active Directory synchronization has been improved around the way the scheduling occurs. Another new feature from a troubleshooting perspective is this log level manager that they released. That for the most part, it's helping you from a troubleshooting perspective. So you're essentially able to track at a more granular level certain entities in the tool, whether projects or resources or tasks. So what it's basically doing is just giving you more information at that deeper level from a logging perspective, and then bringing those into and viewing those ULF logs are much easier to work with, and will help you as an administrator. Maybe not so much as a project manager, but troubleshooting has definitely been an improvement there. So these are some of the kind of key points from more on the back end side of things. When we move into more of the front end, the interface changes and site management, there are some critical changes that have happened there. This is taking the 2013 type interface. They're hiding a lot of things from us. They're making things a lot more accessible from an interface perspective. And then from a site perspective, the ability to drill down into certain areas has definitely been improved. So from the PWA perspective, one of the things that they've done is really the reduction of the options that you have in the quick launch. So when you first go into the PWA site, it looks a lot like the other site that you'd be working with, where there's just a limited number of areas that you can navigate to, which can of course be changed. They also moved the ribbon around a little bit in terms of its accessibility. It's what I'm calling click sensitive. I don't know if that's a term that's out there. It's not context sensitive, it's click sensitive, in the sense that it's hidden for the most part until you need to get to it, then you go and you click it and then it becomes enabled, as opposed to the way the ribbon works in 2010 where it's just always kind of sitting out there, which is nice because it's just simply giving you more real estate to work with. The other thing that they've done is they've added the timeline down into the browser. And a lot of people like to interact with the timeline. The timeline is a great way to get this high-level perspective, really just what's going on within the schedule. So they've pushed that down into the browser, both in the project center and then also into the details of the project schedule. And then just general enhancements in the project center, so it's performing faster, and you can do a little bit more when you're within the project center and you're actually editing a project. So if you're adding tasks, for example, if you're creating dependencies or placing duration or creating an assignment, whatever the case may be, you'll notice that everything is happening much faster, and there's no need to essentially reset the schedule. And I'll show you what that means when we do the demo. So in other words, it feels like you're working in Microsoft Project, at least in part, or a light version of Project Professional as you go in and make edits in within the Project Center. The other one is around the project sites. So essentially what's happening with project sites is that, and you can do this in 2010, you can go out and say, I want to create a new site and I want it to be a project site. Well, they've enhanced that quite a bit. So there's more that you can do with project sites, and this is even outside of project servers. So if you deploy SharePoint 2013 and you use the project sites, they're allowing you to do a lot more in the project site, like open up a task list in Project Professional, for example. So very much like if you were using something like InfoPath, where you say, okay, I want this to open up an InfoPath, you're getting that same type of functionality here. And of course, it gives you all of the collaboration and assignments and document management that you're accustomed to working with. And it has things like the project summary, web parts, and you get the timeline and things like that related to the project site. So definitely some enhancements there that are critical both on the project server side, but also on the non-project server side as well. It also leads us to talking about the whole notion of enterprise projects as opposed to non-enterprise projects, or what we're referring to, or they're referring to rather, as simply a task list within PWA. So when we go into the Project Center, for example, during the demo, and we actually initiate a new project, one of the options is to just simply use a task list. The task list is going to work a lot like just a traditional task list and project site that you'd be working with. The difference is because it is in the project web app, you're able to not only work with it in a traditional manner, but you're also able to convert it into an enterprise project. And I've got a slide that, if we need to, we'll look at later on, time permitting, that shows really what you get and don't get with enterprise projects as opposed to just the standard SharePoint task list as they're known. Really, the beauty of this is that it's allowing for project managers and other users to essentially get started in a much easier way. So there's not all of the, I want to say there's a lot of overhead with initiating projects and earlier versions of Project Server, but there's a certain level of understanding that a project manager needs to have in order to initiate a project, for example. So here, they're just making it much easier. And those SharePoint task lists, by the way, are part of the reporting that PWA will be able to handle. Just some of the big differences is the ability to edit it the same way you're able to edit it in as an enterprise project. So an enterprise project, for example, I can go into the schedule page in PWA and I can insert tasks and dependencies, and I can do my baselines and things like that directly in the browser. These are some things that I can't do with the SharePoint task list. But as I mentioned, they can be converted, and I think that's a very powerful part of it, and we'll look at that during the demo. So speaking of, I referenced Project Online. Talk a little bit about the differences between these two. So, when you start to look at Project 2013, there's always going to be the, bringing the subject of, should we do this, not on premise, do this in the cloud, and what are the benefits of handling that? Well, Microsoft got into this game, if you will, of that being a hosted solution around Project. There's vendors that have been providing hosting services for Project since 2007 and earlier. So it's not like it's new to Project, it's just new to Microsoft. So as part of Office 365, which is Microsoft's play in the cloud-based Office offering, it is probably one of the biggest and strongest moves that Microsoft is making right now, because what they're basically saying is we're no longer going to, as a default, sell you a shrink-wrapped copy of this software that you're going to stick the CD in your servers and share it, and you're going to pay us, per CD and per seat or per server. Instead, they're saying, give us a subscription. It's a subscription-based model. You pay by user. The infrastructure, the data centers are managed by Microsoft, and you basically just tell them how many users you have, and you're going to handle it that way. If you're running a local copy of Microsoft Project, then you can connect to it, or you can pay them as part of the service. And so that's a pretty big move on their part. Of course, you can still do it the on-premise way, if you will, which is also going to have all the considerations that you would normally have, which is around hardware and software costs, also visibility and access requirements. And that's something that you want to be thinking about when you have your team being dispersed and their ability to access the appropriate servers, getting through firewalls and such when you are doing an on-premise type of rollout. And then, of course, the ongoing maintenance, the service packs, the updates, and those types of things, and reliability, and all those different factors. So some things to consider. Now, basically, you simply have more choices. And of course, Microsoft is not the only one that provides the project in the cloud, so to speak. And one of the things that other vendors will provide that Microsoft is not doing today is the ability to add on features and functionality from other vendors, right? So there are other software companies that are building utilities on top of Project Server that a lot of these other hosting companies will be able to provide you. Of course, in the same type of subscription, based model that Microsoft is, but a lot of times they're more on the cutting edge of partnering with these other vendors and being able to offer those out to you. So there's some pluses and minuses on that. And I've got a slide on some pricing, some subscription pricing around Project Online. If you're curious, time permitting, we'll jump to that slide as well. Okay. And there is, just so you guys know, there's a questions area in the GoToWebinar. So if you do have some questions, I won't jump into the questions. As I'm doing the webinar, I'm going to just kind of reserve probably 10 minutes on covering those questions. But by all means, just drop them in there, and I'll make sure that I cover those as we go through, because I see a couple coming in. So from a demonstration perspective, a couple things that I wanted to cover in this particular demonstration, and then once we finish up this slide, I'm also going to talk about what we'd be covering in the next webinar. I want to go into some of those interface enhancements that have been mentioned, particularly around the way project managers are going to be able to do edits directly within the browser, and where those enhancements are coming from. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then some of the administration changes. So I want to show you essentially what you're getting when you're in the Project Web app from an admin perspective, and then what you see out in the central admins. I want to look at the two differences there. And then we'll talk a little bit about the management, this whole notion of the the SharePoint task list as opposed to the enterprise project, and essentially how these sites are being managed. And then that's going to take us into permissions. Permissions is a big area here. because this is if there is a significant change between the approaches that you have with the Project Web App, I would say it lies on the permissions, along with, of course, all the other great things. But permissions is big because we are now able to use this tool in a more of a SharePoint-like manner, where when I teach administration, project server for administrators, for example, I always make sure that we cover the security portion of it in the morning, right after they've had their coffee, because it's a very complex topic, and it gives us multiple options. But in order for us to understand all of the things in which we can configure the security, we need to understand, in a pretty great detail about what's going on there. But with the SharePoint permission mode, it just makes it easier for just saying, you know what, I need this person to be able to do this on this particular project, and let me go ahead and grant them those rights. But you have choices. You can't mix the permissions. You basically need to make a choice between one or the other. You can change the permissions, but just keep in mind you will lose some functionality if you do that. But we'll talk about that as we go through. Okay, so let me flip it over here. And we're going to take a look at this quick demo. I'm just going to move a couple things around here, guys. So what you'll see coming up here shortly is an instance of the Project Web App. And I'm going to share that screen again and put this into full screen. Hopefully this looks okay. We were showing this and it wasn't as good as I would have liked it to have been from the perspective of the resolution. Hopefully it's okay to, let's make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so hopefully that looks a little bit better. Okay, so essentially we are looking at the new interface for the project from the Project Web App. So a couple of things to just bear in mind, as I mentioned, I'm coming in as the admin, so I'm going to see everything. So the whole notion of the security trimming, for example, is still at play here. Let me make sure that screen looks okay. I'm going to do one thing here to see if this helps. Then. Okay, hopefully that's better. All right, so it is security trimmed. So if I was to come in as a project manager or a team member or a portfolio manager, what I see would be slightly different. Now, when we talk about the SharePoint permission model, some of that changes a little bit because you are not automatically added into a group when you are added to the Project Web App, and that's why they, for the most part, trim a lot of the navigational items and such from the tool or from the interface out of the box. So let's first just talk a little bit about some of the interface type elements. So you'll notice that, and those of you who've been working with Project a little bit before, and I'm kind of making an assumption that you have, if you're relatively new to the Project Web App, this is what's known as the quick launch, and this is for the most part how you navigate to the different areas of the tool. So one of the very first things that you're seeing here when you get to the Project Web App in 2013 is that they've opened things up. You notice here that you don't see this ribbon kind of hanging off the top, so you just have simply more real estate, and they also have given us this timeline here. Adding projects in the timeline is a very easy thing to do. You have to manually do it. They don't automatically put them up there. You can add and remove projects from the timeline as you need them. But again, things are hidden unless you need to get to that area. Now, as I mentioned, regarding the click sensitivity, here we see it. When I click up in the project tab, it immediately then opens up the ribbon. Now I can do some different things within the project. Okay. Also, from the perspective of the ability to what they call focus on on content, you'll notice on the far right-hand side there's this ability for me to basically hide and show very quickly in the upper right-hand corner, right, what I need to see and what I don't need to see. So if I come back up to the projects, and let's say I want to initiate a new project, well, you can see here that all of this functionality is pretty much the same as what we remember from the earlier version. So if I need to go in and get to a particular project, I can click on my row selector, hit open. I still have the options of editing in the browser or working with Project Professional. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on when we click on a project and we're actually now drilling into the project itself. So I'm going to pick on this CVT implementation project. So I'm basically just clicking on the project itself and drilling down into it. So clicking on the project then takes me into the actual schedule. And again, we're seeing that there's the click sensitivity around the ribbon area. I still get my tabs up here that I can interact with, but when I click on them is when the actual ribbon shows up so that I can start to work with the project itself. Now, because I just simply clicked on the project, I'm essentially looking at this in a read-only mode. So as soon as I want to start making changes to this schedule, I can go up and say, I'm going to go ahead and edit this. So if I edit this in the browser, I'm now checking out the project. This is the same way it worked in 2010, so that I can now interact and make actual changes to the schedule itself. So there's still going to be a lot of the same type of keyboard functionality here within the schedule itself. So if I hit the insert key, for example, it drops a task in there, right? I have things like the undo. I just did a Control-Z there to undo. Notice that I have undo here as well. So more control down here. So a couple of key things that we're seeing here within the ribbon. Also some things that we're not seeing, like the recalculate. So in other words, if I simply click in the task itself, and let me go ahead and do that insert again, and let's say I'm going to review, right, scope, and I'll come over here and I'll just set it to auto. Notice that it's immediately plugging in all the relevant information, but I'm not having to recalculate anything within the schedule, right? So if I create a dependency, notice what immediately is occurring, right? It's changing in my schedule, and it's automatically formatting it the way it should be formatting. Okay, so really that may seem somewhat minor to you, but it's going to, from the perspective of time saving and things like that, there's certainly something to be said about it. But again, for the most part, when you are interacting with a schedule like this, the performance is certainly going to be enhanced here. Now, when I'm working within the schedule like this, one of the things that you're noticing is that the navigation is just slightly different here in the Quick Launch, in that I can drill into the project site, for example. Let me stay on that page. Let me save that first. But notice that the project site is right below the schedule here, making it easy for me to essentially navigate and drill down into the site itself. So I'm going from the schedule right into the site. And what you're accustomed to doing in 2010, which is a pretty significant change here, is that when we go into the site, we're no longer working with a pop-up window. We are going directly into the site itself within that same window. There's a lot to be said about that, because now you're not having to manage as many windows. So now I'm in the project site. Notice that there's some subtle differences here within the site itself, but you still see a lot of the same functionality around documents, right? You'll also notice you have your tasks here, right? Notice the difference here when you're working with the tasks now within 2013 is that it's bringing the tasks directly down into the site, and that's something that we didn't get in 2010. So they're pushing more down, if you will, from a site perspective, and I think that's a pretty important modification or change. And you'll also notice that this project can only be edited through the Project Web App. So it's just telling you that this is great for viewing. You can look at it here, but if you need to go in and do some edits to the actual schedule, you need to do it from you need to edit the actual app itself. Okay. And so notice when I go into the project details, it basically takes me right back up to the schedule, and I'm just back to where I was. Okay, so navigation for the most part is hugely improved and enhanced here. Okay, so that's a little bit on the site portion of it. Let's move on, and I want to show you a little bit more on the administrative side of things and where those changes were made. So I'm going to navigate back up to the Project Web App, and I'm on the home page. One of the things that they did is they removed the administrative link from the left-hand side, making it much easier to work with. And what they did is they popped it up here in the upper right-hand corner under this PWA settings. So I was mentioning during the slide presentation is that they separated what a typical project server administrator would be managing as to more of perhaps a SharePoint IT administrator would be managing. So there's less options here when you go into the PWA settings. You're doing your custom fields, you're working with resources and workflows and views and such within this particular area, but you'll notice that from a database perspective and in a queue management perspective, you don't find those options here. If I go into the central admin, which I have, let me actually just start from the main page of the central admin. So now I'm in the CA. And from the central admin under the general application settings, you'll notice that there is a PWA settings, and you have the ability to manage the PWA settings here. And one of the reasons why this is also important is that you could very easily have multiple PWA instances that are in this farm. And so I can change the PWA instance that I'm working with here within CA. So if I'm a central, SharePoint, farm administrator, for example, I want to be able to do the PWA management just on this one screen. So I can jump to my different instances very easily here. And so notice it's just going to switch over, and then I'm going to be able to see my queue job. And not to say that I can't do everything from one area or the other. You'll notice that there is some duplication, and it's particularly around the queuing and the backing up. You'll notice that you see the managed queue jobs here as well. But the backups, right, the scheduled backups and the restores are managed here. And here, I can delete a project, but the backup and restores are managed through the CA. Okay, so it's just really going to be a matter of you determining responsibility and stuff like that around, some of these administrative tasks, right? But they changed it. They changed the location, and that's a pretty big change there. Okay. All right. So the other thing that we were going to talk about is, let me go back to the PWA settings, and I'm just simply going to navigate to the Project Web App site. Let's talk a little bit about the from a site perspective, how the creation of a project and also the creation of the project site, exactly how that works, and really the differences between the two. It's a pretty significant change, and that'll then lead us into talking about permissions. When I go to projects, which is the project center, the very first thing that you'll notice when I go into the ribbon from the projects tab is the difference here. So you'll notice that I have an enterprise project option, and I also have the ability to create a SharePoint task list. Now I already have one out here. It's called my demo list, and I created it by simply just doing a new and then doing a SharePoint task list. The subtlety that you'll notice is that the icon is just a little bit different, but for the most part, it is listed here in the project center, right? But it is not considered an enterprise project, and it has some limitations, and I'll bring up the slide here of what those limitations are here in a moment. But for the most part, the creation of it is very similar to an enterprise project. So you can really think of it as kind of a scaled down or a lightweight project, and I think that's really just the perfect way to think about it. And it may not even be necessarily a lightweight project that is eventually going to be an enterprise project, it can just be managed all the way through completion here, right? In this particular area. So you'll notice this looks a lot like the enterprise project that I was working in. It has a document, there's a tasks area, there's a calendar, there's a project details, there's a deliverables, there's a risks, right? There's all the same type of collaboration and assignment that you would be you'd be able to work with, in an enterprise project. Some of the subtleties, you'll notice that I'm going into project details, and then now I'm jumping into the project schedule, and because I want to show you the difference between the two, is that here what you're noticing for the most part as I'm working with this is telling me only enterprise projects can be edited here. To edit this project, use Microsoft Project with the task list in the SharePoint site. So what it's basically saying is you can interact with it almost identical to the way you're working with an enterprise project, but that's one of the limitations. It is, however, telling us that we can actually edit this guy as a regular project. So if I go back into the main project, I can basically tell it I want to work with this in Microsoft Project. So this list, this SharePoint task list, can be edited in Microsoft Project. I can create new tasks, I can create assignments, and then I'm still publishing, but it's not a traditional Microsoft project. Okay, so those are just some of the things that we want to be thinking about, that you still get all the functionality of Microsoft Project, because that would be one of the big areas that might, that we might consider and say, well, I really don't want to be limited by the fact that I can't work with Microsoft Project, so I need to have it as an enterprise project, and that's simply not the case. And for the most part, one of the limits is what we saw there in that navigational area that was saying, listen, this needs to be an enterprise project in order for you to interact and work with it. Now I'm looking for the edit in Microsoft Project option here. We'll find it. So let me show you where you actually convert the projects, which is very straightforward. So if you decide that here's a project, it was initiated as a as a SharePoint task list, and now we want to convert it. I'm going to go back to the project web app, and it's really just a matter of saying, now I want it to be essentially an enterprise project, so they can be upgraded or activated is the proper term very easily. So if I go back to the project web app settings, and again, this is more of an admin function, and under connected SharePoint sites, you'll see the list of all of essentially the sites that are associated with this particular instance that I can activate. So there's my demo list, and here's my enterprise project features, and I can say, okay, my demo list, I want to now activate that. And notice that you can deactivate those that are enterprise projects into lists. So that's a pretty, that's a pretty significant thing here. That's a pretty big change related to the, related to the way we just manage our projects. And hopefully there's probably a couple of questions on that. I'll certainly get to those as we go through. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk through is around moving into this whole notion of permission. So let me go back to my PWA settings. And this is speaking to a little bit on users that have been working in 2007. In 2007, when you start to interact with putting resources, or you start to put resources in the tool, one of the very first things that you will be thinking about and considering is what type of rights do they need to have within the tool. In other words, if I come in here and I add a new resource, I'm going to need to place that resource into some type of group. And what that group is going to do is basically going to drive, it's going to drive what type of rights that they have. got kicked off there. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that. What type of rights the users have within the tool. So that's a pretty significant element when you're working with projects, because you're saying, okay, this person's a team member, right? And that team member is going to be expected to be working on these particular projects, and so they will have rights as it relates to that group affiliation, if you will, in the tool. When you are working in the SharePoint mode, it's more in alignment with the way you would deal with SharePoint permissions. In other words, you have users that are in the tool, and they're associated to to an Active Directory group that they have. So they're users within the system, right? And we can go find them, and we can add them to certain elements within SharePoint, whether it's a SharePoint site, or it's a document library, or it's a list, or it's an item within a library. Whatever the case may be, we can provide accessibility to them. And so that's the way SharePoint works. So in the SharePoint permissions mode, it's a lot more like that. But what they're going to do for us in the Project Web App, when we're working in this SharePoint mode, is they're going to give us these very project server security-like groups that we can interact with. Okay, so our way of thinking is just a little bit different. So with that said, for example, if I go into the projects area, and I'm going to go pick on a project again that we can work with. And what I want to illustrate to you is essentially the notion of the way permissions are going to work here within the project. So I'll go back just simply to that CBT implementation, right? And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just take it, and I'm going to go into the into the browser for editing. So I'm going to interact with this project. I'm going to do something with this project. And so when we're in 2013, when we start thinking about giving rights to a particular location, we're thinking about sharing. Sharing now becomes an important part of providing accessibility. So the first thing that you'll notice, and I'm going to go to the project site first, so we can see what the sharing dialog box is essentially going to show us when we do that. So if I go into the CBT implementation, and I'm here within the project site, and I go back up to the share area, this is where I would essentially say I want this user to be able to interact with this particular site. Okay, so if I click on the show option, and I click on what are known as permission levels, and those of you who are coming from a SharePoint background, you're accustomed to seeing this: contribute, full control, read. And in fact, when you're working in Project Server 2010 and you are dealing with sites, and you say, well, I want to give explicit rights to this user for a particular site, these are the types of levels that you're going to see: contribute, full control, read. That's what you're already accustomed to working with, and that gives that user those certain rights. Now, if I go back one level, I just want to come back to where I was within the schedule. And then I go back into the share area, and then I go into the options. What you're going to notice is that now, notice what it's saying here: selected group or permission level. But now we have more project server security type of language that's being used here, right? Team members, resource manager, project manager. So what they've essentially have done in this SharePoint mode is that they've given us these different permission levels, right, that are more in line with what we saw with the project server security in terms of what a user needs to be able to do. So that's a pretty significant change here, because one of the things that we would always talk about with permissions in Project Server 2010 is that when I was working with a user, that if I wanted to set project level permissions, I would have to use essentially the project permissions area within the project server security. If I was somehow limited as a team member, for example, and I was yet granted those permissions at a different level, I would still not be able to do that because I was being denied that particular right, for example. So this is changing kind of the way we can think about things when we're working in this SharePoint mode. And it's not that I'm advocating this mode, it's just that it gives you another option. You might be thinking about it as an easier way to enter into this tool than going the project service security. And it may be more of a maturity where when and if it's required that you need more stringent security parameters around the project, that you then move to the project service security model. And as I mentioned, that's one of the things that we'll be talking about in even greater detail in one of the upcoming webinars. But again, I just wanted to kind of give you a high level perspective on that, on that particular topic. Okay, so that kind of rounds off the demonstration portion of it. I did want to give us some time around the questions. There is something around wanting to know what the project pricing is for Project Online, and we do have something on that. But let me look at these questions here. Okay, so this question around the presentation download. I'm recording this, so as